makes sense.
That sounds fair enough to me.
Hello.
The robot tells me the recording is in process.
It is indeed. And who am I moderating?
You're moderating, yes.
Yeah.
Excellent, good. I thought I was, but I didn't want to start if someone else thought they were. Okay, hello everyone. I'm John, and I'm moderating this panel about well, various awesome things, but in this particular case, role-playing games beyond Dungeons and Dragons. I am your moderator, I am your co-punctuation runner, and I have been playing games for a while, and I have a keen interest in playing various non-D&D RPGs, but I shall let the rest of my panel introduce themselves. We'll go in alphabetical order by first name. So David, I'll start with you.
Hello, well, yeah, my name's David Lascelles. I am a teacher, a writer, and I've also been playing games for a hell of a long time, going right back to the 80s, really, which is what I'm going to talk about a little bit in this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then Russell?
Yes, of course, alphabetical order. Hi, my name's Russell. Also an author, sometime historian, and recently turning my hand to RPG writer as well. So nice to be along.
Then Z.
Hi, yeah, I'm Z. I've been playing RPGs for quite a while, as is common for people of a certain age. I started with video games first, and then kind of moved into tabletop things. So the thing that we can blame for the fact that I'm excited about RPGs is actually a little troika video game called Arcanum of Steamworks and Magic Obscura, which is one of my favorites and is very much one of those, oh, they tried to put dice mechanics in and it didn't quite work type video games. But I started with actual dice with one of the vampire games, which tells you what sort of tragic goth I was and still am.
I adore Arcanum. It is one of my favourite video games of all time.
I'm so glad someone else has heard of and likes it.
I can't play it though because, well, the copy I have is on disc anyway, and I don't know if the current computer could handle it as weird as.
If you had the big box version that had the manual that had the halfling banana bread recipe in it, I envy you deeply. But also, I will buy you it on Steam if you want it.
It's fine.
So we're kind of talking about role-playing games specifically in the context of Dungeons and Dragons, and this is, I think, probably mostly because D&D is by far the most popular role-playing game out there at the moment, and probably the one that if you've heard of a role-playing game, you've heard of Dungeons and Dragons. So I guess I want to start with like how much. Where did people get their starts? So Z mentioned that she got her start through Vampire, but where did everyone else come into the scene? My first was Tazlanta, which is a fantasy RPG, which is kind of, my recollection is D&D with the serial numbers filed off, but I might be being unfair. It's been a while. So David, where did you get your start in RPGs?
So when I was at school, going way back, some people at school started playing the big box D&D, which, you know, sort of ages me a bit. And they sort of did it at lunchtime in the break room inside. And so I got involved a little bit with that. But eventually I actually found there was another system which I really liked, which was actually a lot easier than D&D, at the same time, which is Dragon Warriors. And me and a few friends of mine used to go and play that around at each other's houses at Saturday afternoon for hours, and it was always a great deal of fun. But that was a very British role-playing game, that one. And I think it's very obscure. I'm not sure anyone's heard of it anymore, but it is still out there, and we'll talk about that a bit later on if need be. But after that, at university, I moved into running the games club at the university for a while. We did all sorts of games there. So we did Rolemaster, we did Star Wars, we did Shadowrun, and you know, it was sort of from there a lot more games that existed beyond D&D, effectively. Russ, one of my members.
Yeah, it's a good thing David went first there, because I was about to give you an answer which I realised wasn't strictly speaking accurate. So, but yeah, I had time to think it through. So, so the first time I had hold of it, so the first role-playing book I acquired was actually D&D's Oriental Adventures source book, but I didn't play anything for a year or for a good couple of years after I managed to pick it up, which is when I got to uni, of course. Joined a bunch of clubs and societies, and the first RPG I remember being invited to was actually a game of GURPS. So we were doing a detective agency sort of thing. So of course, having never done this sort of thing before, went straight for which frankly one of my first and continuing loves. So I ran straight down the James Bond wannabe character type. And what was brilliant was he was very bad at it.
Excellent stuff. And C, what was your kind of, do you want to touch a little bit more on your early role-playing experiences?
Yeah, because I did realize that technically I had a brush with the sort of things that involved dice prior to Vampire, but it didn't stick, because I tried to get into painted miniature tabletop battle things. A little bit of an interest in Warhammer, mostly because, ooh, look at all that juicy lore. Look at chaos, which appeals to any teenager. But then there was another one that was coming out around the time, which was called War Machine, which was a little, it wasn't quite a Warhammer knockoff. It was a little bit steampunky. There was a sort of a necromancy contingent called the Strix, I think, whose big giant warjacks were powered by the burning souls of the dead, which again, terrible goth teenager, very appealing. The fact that I can have these monstrous black mechs lit from within by unholy flames. But I don't have a very steady hand and I'm bad at painting, so that didn't really work. Whereas I can write things down on a piece of paper and I'm okay at not throwing dice under the sofa. So Vampire the Masquerade kind of was the first proper thing I campaigned in. Then I got to uni and lo, D&D emerged. It was 3.5, so we had every splat book under the sun and made a lot of terrible mistakes by using incredibly badly balanced everything, which was a right mess. But I did also discover Paranoia. Paranoia is fantastic. There is a new version of it, I'm told, which is very good, which I still haven't played, but I highly recommend playing Paranoia in the zappy version rather than the straight version, because if you have someone who's good at being friend computer, you will have a time which is both very, very fun and very terrifying, which is exactly what you want. All gathered round a table, looking to the person who controls your fate and trying desperately to lie that it wasn't your fault that things went in the incinerator.
Yes.
Dark Overlord.
Max in the chat has pointed out that my first role-playing game was in fact a Call of Cthulhu one-shot at her house, and that is true. I do remember that. I remember that the person running the one-shot gave my character 100 in Mythos, and I said, "Oh, I could do really well at that." And he said, "No, that's a mistake. If you do that much, you'd be insane." Which, you know, was a good introduction. So I think we're going to talk about games that aren't D&D, and a lot of the ones we've mentioned so far, I feel like, are the bigger games. They're sort of not Wizards level big, but not kind of tiny indie games either. So what do you think are the key advantages that the bigger games in the scene that aren't D&D can bring to the table? Like, what do they do well and what do they do badly? David, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think the one I've had most experience with would be the storyteller system and Oz Magica, which were both obviously quite big and have been big for a long time. I think what I noticed they brought to D&D, what they brought to role-playing in general, was that D&D couldn't, was the it was more about social interaction. It's more about story. It was more about doing these epic things. It wasn't just, I mean, I think a lot of the time they kind of evolve into, oh, you've rolled dice, oh, you've missed, that sort of very, very structured combat thing. Whereas in the storyteller system, your social skills were more important, your intelligence was more important, and you could also, a lot of it was about the story rather than just the dice. I think that's what they brought to it. And especially Osmond Jigger, which had this whole idea of it being a sort of set of many years. It sort of, you played as a group, running a coven in a tower somewhere in the world, and sort of you could like have sort of several years between adventures. Sometimes so you get that progression of story between things happening. I think you don't often see in D&D. I mean, you can do it in D&D. There's nothing to stop you doing it, but that was a sort of central point of the design, was that idea of this is about story, not about winning.
Russell, do you want to?
I'm there thinking nostalgically now about an Ars Magic campaign I was in a few years back now. It was exactly that. We just had so much fun with it because we had like main characters here, but the grogs who you're not supposed to care about so much ended up getting their own adventures and all sorts of things. Beautiful. Oh, crikey, I've got to go back to the actual question you asked. Sorry. So yeah, I think, well, one thing the big names certainly do have in their favor is obviously the branding power. So what that does for them is makes them an excellent gateway. So people who hadn't been involved in role playing before, now through various things, everybody's heard of D&D, and if they hadn't, even if that wasn't the case 10 years ago, some Stranger Things hit the decks, that was a game changer again. So I mean, yeah, just on pure ability to, oh yeah, I'll give this a go. It's like Ticket to Ride with board games, similar kind of effect. So yeah, I mean that's a big thing they do well. For me. Depending on the game, it's not always simplicity isn't always a thing you can get in for the one shots. I wouldn't necessarily like to do say GURPS for a one shot unless the GM had given me a pre-generated character and basically told me everything that I do and don't do, and then I don't have to dig into the other stuff. So I mean, I'll probably talk about it elsewhere, but something like Savage Worlds is great for that, because it's just like, oh yeah, character, half an hour, off you go. Let's
That makes sense. C, what do you see as the kind of pros and cons or the strengths of indie games, bigger indie games?
I think some of the as far as the bigger ones that are they're maybe a little more established and a little less indie. What they have is a thematic cohesion. D&D is huge and sprawling, and sometimes tries to be a little bit of everything all at once, which, given that it doesn't really have the social system unless you're a bard and decided to dump a bunch of your points into taking a bunch of very specific skills. Things which David kind of touched on, the fact that some games have that kind of storytelling. It's a social system. I think the fact that the Cthulhu and the kind of Delta Green spin-offy things from that went, okay, let's be horror. Let's just be horror. We're not going to try and be horror in space. We're not going to try and be horror dating sim. We're not going to try and be horror dungeon crawls. We're going to be just solid eldritch horror. Whereas D&D goes, in space, Spelljammer, dark horror times in Barovia. It wants to be a bit of everything, and it's flexible. You can do a lot with it, but having something which knows what it's doing and does that thing, and does one thing well rather than doing a million things haphazardly, I think is a big advantage, which you see quite a lot with the White Wolf series of games, which are, okay, mages, we'll be mages. Let's just do that. Vampire, we'll be vampires. Let's just do that. You can overlap them, which can break things in some really interesting ways. But having a little bit of a focus, I think, is really, really useful.
And I think, oh, sorry, I think your point there is actually one of the really big points I see as the strength of going beyond D&D, because I had a friend who wanted to run a campaign in a world he had created himself, and he had this whole like low magic setting where magic was really a taboo thing because there'd been a war ages ago and like everyone was very twitchy about it, and there used to be elves but now there aren't, and some people have elf ears because of reasons, and it was all very interesting. But unfortunately he ran it in D&D, and the mechanics did not at all reinforce any of the themes he wanted to play with, which I made it really frustrating because it was a really interesting concept, but D&D sort of assumes a base level of like availability of magic items and stuff that just wasn't. So it's a good, you know, master of no trades, jack of all. That's the wrong way around. But yes, Russell, sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I was just very quickly, I was thinking, out of all of the White Wolf games, though, Mage was the one I'd be most likely to say is a bit more of a complex toolbox, because you can if you've got the right, depending on how your group set up is, you can do practically anything. We often have.
I learned in Mage you never plan much about what the players might do in a situation, because they'll always do something else entirely. I had someone in one game make a tank out of bits of bark in a wheelchair, and it was like, that actually works, but I didn't think you'd do that.
That's yeah. So obviously D&D is a kind of big on the combat aspect, and David pointed out kind of one of the strengths of other games is that you can explore kind of more combat light games, and other games are more suited to that, because D&D 5 has kind of given you advantage and disadvantage, which starts to get to kind of rewards for role play, but it's not. There are games that do it better, shall we say. I mean, I'm glad 5th edition moves in that direction. But so do people have any recommendations for games that reward kind of social interaction or reward good role playing as opposed to being more focused on the combat? And David, you mentioned a couple, but do you want to kind of
I think one of the things that enforces reduced combat more social is making your combat more lethal. I think so in D&D, a reasonably level fighter can go in can survive quite a lot of damage before they go down. Whereas in other games, Dragon Warriors is the first game I really played seriously. In that, you don't get the hit point ramp up quite so much. So even at like quite a high level, you're still very vulnerable to a sword strike. And a lot of freeform LARP as well goes for this idea that, you know, one hit you down. So combat is horribly lethal. And I think there's one, I haven't played this one, but there's one based on the Anarchy, a LARP game there where the combat is, if your armor goes down and you take a hit, you're basically dead. There's no healing. There's, you know, you're either permanently disabled or dead. So that tends to encourage players to be a little bit more cautious, and that's will tend to trigger the social interaction more. And I think obviously the big ones for social stuff is I mean, Vampire is the big one for that, because it is supposed to be a political game. It's not supposed to be a go out there and with a machine gun and shoot people. It's meant to be a manipulate people, gain influence sort of thing. I always found difficult to do in tabletop. I think Vampire worked better live for me, but that's just a personal opinion. But yeah, that's what I think. What you need to do is make combat an actual threat, an actual danger.
Give people a good incentive to talk their way out of problems rather than just taking the flamethrower to it straight away.
yeah, talk first and fight later if necessary.
Yeah, it's a real. I tell you what, it's a real lesson in figuring out your group first, and then see what kind of adventure they want to they want to be going on. If you're going for a massively political Cold War drama, and you've sat in a room when when all of your players have spent an hour discussing between them the relative killing power, stopping power of various ammunition rounds out of the gun list, you've got to kind of wonder if you might want to do a different game at that point. But yeah, I am I'm in 2 games at the moment, and of course, those astute members watching the chat see that one of my GMs is here. So,
hi, Martin.
So that's so yeah, and in fact, even after first, so yeah, in fact, even after GURPS was my first game, GURPS is also my most recent. But they're very different games. We're doing an Infinite Worlds at the moment. Which is some part Stargate, some part early Doctor Who, and some part The Crown. It's long story, but but yeah, we're not really playing characters who want to be getting into fights if we can at all avoid it, because, well, for one thing, we do know we do know it's not going to go well for us half the time. We do have people for that, and they're great at it, and we try and hold everything up before that. But yeah,
okay,
definitely encouraging discussion.
Z, do you?
Weirdly enough, I think actually, in terms of things that encourage discussion, it wouldn't be the thing that you would automatically think of, but I feel like the Call of Cthulhu and Delta Green ones particularly, because if you're getting into a fight in those games, you've already lost, because whatever it is, you shouldn't be fighting it head on. So those are games which encourage you to spend a lot of time talking, planning, finding alternative routes around things, researching. If you spend an entire session where your characters are doing nothing more than being really careful about books, that's a perfectly good session that's probably done some really amazing stuff for your long-term campaign. This is a game where you can, depending on how cautious you are and how generous your GM is, potentially like run into the king in yellow and tell him that he doesn't mix a very good martini. Having that very, very social aspect, because as David's mentioned, the combat becomes just that little bit too terrifying to risk except as a last possible resort. It encourages a lot of more creative and social role playing, finding ways of avoiding the problem at all if you possibly can.
So I think that touches on something really interesting, which is I think the tack you've all taken there is to kind of talk about discouraging combat, in the sense that combat is very deadly, and therefore your players will want to avoid it. I'm wondering whether we could touch on some kind of go towards the more indie end of the spectrum at this point in the panel, and start touching on role-playing games like Fiasco and things like that, where it's not that, and I think these do skew more indie in general. I can't think of any super mainstream ones that just, but Fiasco effectively just doesn't have rules for combat. It's not in the system. So if you want to do it, you can describe it narratively, but there's no mechanical framework for it. And so I'm wondering, like, do we think that is something that is becoming more available as kind of smaller game makers can get their stuff up through things like Itch or through Kickstarter?
Oh boy, yes.
Well, I mean, it's a leading question. So I'll start with if I start with you, Z, because you are clearly champing at the bit to
I was
talk
going to
about
say
this.
Yeah, I've been for the past couple of weeks digging through itch that you've just mentioned and compiling a spreadsheet of games that were part of a big charity bundle so that you can actually find out what's in the damn bundle, because there's 1,200 games and there's no way for you to actually humanly dig through all of that. And I'm finding a lot of pen and paper RPGs, and an awful lot of them are social rather than combat. The one I've got up in front of me right now is one called Tale's End, which is an RPG about a group sitting together and reflecting at the end of a journey. It's an improvisational storytelling one where you get together and you talk about the adventure that you've had together and what brought you together, and who's potentially going to be leaving the group to go off on a final quest in a different direction. And it's that kind of retrospective, which is a really interesting way of doing it for me, and is also a kind of a great example of that kind of little indie thing that you find in places like itch that doesn't necessarily get big publishing. But if you've got a fiver spare, you can play around with some small, very niche thing that's all about those social interactions, that's all about how we talk to each other, how we behave with each other. Even when it's an adventure RPG, it's about reflecting on the adventure rather than about killing the biggest number of goblins with a magical +5 sword.
Russell, do you want to talk about?
Yeah, so one I keep hearing about, and I'm well, I've kind of put myself in a queue for a friend of mine who mentioned might be running it someday. As well, is running a series of one shots. Was Monster Hearts, which I know is I know has become very popular lately, and I'm sure there is. I haven't seen it. I'm sure, being that you're involved in you're often involved as supernatural creatures, that there is combat involved in it. From everything I gather and all of my reading up on my friends having adventures with it, the social the social aspect of that, including navigating social awkwardness with some of the characters is a very key part of it, and it just looks fascinating. It's very much it's very much teen high school drama, just with added monsters. So it sounds fantastic. That was the first thing I thought of when you mentioned the question. Anyway.
David, do you?
Well, I definitely think the obviously the internet and social media has opened up a lot more possibilities for people, and they say those sort of sites are quite useful because people can basically post their own ideas as well, and it's quite on things like forums. You can run little sort of RPGs on forums as well. You certainly were doing it sort of like 10 years ago, and I'm guessing you can run them on social media. You can do all sorts of things with that sort of lots of small social stuff. I know a lot of live role play has now been done on Zoom, for example. And a lot of that obviously isn't combat based, it's going to be heavily social based. And of course, I think the big one I've got familiarity with is the idea of the chamber LARP, which are usually very small, very sort of very social based, problem solving, sometimes quite bizarre and surreal. Live role play setups, which are quite fun to play, and they again, there's no combat in those because in most of the venues you run them, you can't have combat. So it's a case of you're sat in a small room, and it's you're talking. You may as well be tabletoping, just in a costume. So yeah, I think it's definitely growing, and I think there's more of a market for stuff that isn't quite so combat focused, and that is definitely growing.
Yeah, I've just dumped another handful in the chat. There's one called A Council of Cats, which is in some games you are an all-powerful, benevolent god emperor, and in some games you're cats, and in this one you're both. Try to save your city from destruction while being a handful of cats.
Nice, very
Uh,
good stuff.
There's one called Damn the Man, Save the Music, which I really want to play because it's about trying to save your tiny indie record store from closing and is based on all of those kind of 90s music themed slacker
Yeah,
comedies.
showing me that one
Yes.
yesterday. I think that's the one that looks like a Nick Hornby movie, which is
And since you mentioned Fiasco, I had to dump the last one there, which is the Untitled Ghost game, which is someone really enjoyed the Untitled Goose Game and went, but what if it was a poltergeist? And what if we took a bunch of influence from Fiasco? So what if our whole group of players together were a
Oh my
poltergeist
God.
terrifying a small English village?
And what I've just found out is that that Untitled Ghost game is in a bundle called the Ghost to Ghost 2020 bundle. So I might have to buy that.
I thought we
So-
were going to mention poltergeists or something for a minute there.
On the topic of stuff I found in the Itch bundle, because Z mentioned the Itch bundle. So people who don't know, itch.io is a website that sells games. And they did a bundle last year for racial justice, and they've done a bundle this year for Palestine and relief in Palestine. And both had kind of a 4-figure number of games in, like a truly astounding number of games. And I don't know what proportion of each was tabletop games, but like a sizable chunk. And the game I found, or the games I found in the Itch bundle for racial justice were based on, or the ones I've played so far that I've been really excited about are what's called Descended from the Queen games. Now I'm going to paste a link in the chat. So Descended from the Queen games are games based on an open rule set that was released by Alex Roberts from her game For the Queen. And the way For the Queen works is that you play cards, and you'll pick up a card and it'll say like, name a time, and I'm going to do a terrible example because I'm not a games designer, so like whatever I come up with off the spur of my head is not going to be as good as what a professional games designer comes up with after thinking about it. But like, it'll be like, how did you lie to the Queen? Or how did the Queen hurt you? And you have to tell stories around like your character's relationship to this figure who is never in the game, but is the focus of the game. And then at the end, the final card, which everyone has to discuss, will be something like, when the Queen's reign ends, like, do you stand by her or do you go against her? And this has led to kind of different ones. So we played one that was which was called Defending the Corp. And it was all about the evil cyberpunk-esque corporation you work for and your relationship to your corporation. And then it says, like, when the hackers come, do you defend it? And we played it with some people at work, and it got super, like, it's super interesting to watch people build a story collaboratively like that. And that's one of the standouts I found in the Itch bundle. And actually, Alex has done another game called Starcrossed, which is with a Jenga tower, and you play 2 characters who are the game, I think, is like, it's about really, really wanting to when you really, really can't. And it's 2 characters who are kind of in love but can't admit that they're in love, so Romeo and Juliet style maybe, but with less like creepy undertones of like child romance. And you pull blocks from the tower when certain things happen, and the point at which the tower collapses is like the culmination of your relationship. And that's a really interesting way of like using the Jenga tower as a metaphor for like the intensity of dating, which is really interesting. So like, I recommend looking up her games because she does really interesting stuff. And so David and Russell, have you kind of picked out anything from like big bundles that have kind of made you happy, or found anything, like any gems that kind of have kind of surprised you in that way, or not so much?
My answer is going to be short, just because I haven't had much. I haven't had much opportunity to do so far. So not really. I keep hearing about things, but yeah.
Some people have made spreadsheets to help you dissect them, and I believe Z is working on one for the Palestine bundle.
Yes, I'm a quarter of the way through, and proportionally, things which are, I've marked stuff down as paper if it looks like it's a printout, pen and paper, PDF-y type thing. There are 60 of those from the 375 games and items that I've catalogued so far. So that's roughly the proportion.
I mean, I'm pretty much the same as Russ. I at the minute haven't got time to explore these things as much as I would have probably liked or may have had in the past. But yeah,
Fair.
all looks interesting.
Clearly, at Punctuation 3, I should GM some of the better itch bundle games. That could be fun. So we are 20 minutes from the end, which is bizarre because I feel like we started talking 5 minutes ago. But we have had some questions in the chat as we've been talking and some comments. And if people in the chat do have questions for the panel, please do write them in and I will ask them. So firstly, I'm just going to mention something that I believe, I'm very sorry, I think it's Isla, but please correct me if I'm wrong and I will say it again, who has played a fair bit of D&D, but has also got the ultimate micro RPG book. So I am going to show this off. This is the ultimate micro RPG book. You buy it from Waterstones. It's like 12 quid, and it's got a bunch of 2-page micro RPGs in it, which is brilliant. So I recommend that. And also says that they played the one with the candles, and I know, I can't remember what it's called, but it's one with 12 candles and the game session ends when they've all run out.
Is my room in it? Sorry.
I do not think so, but brilliant. And Phil asks, does the panel find that having mechanics for social interaction stifle creativity? Is that something we found, or does anyone have any opinions on that?
I think it depends a bit on your GM as much as anything else, because there are a couple of ways it can go. There's the, I want to find a mechanic to solve my problem, in which case it can be a bit stifling because it means people are fitting their thought processes into the mechanics. D&D is a great example of this, where it's like, so I want to get someone to do this. Is that persuasion? Is that intimidation? What am I rolling for that? Which can be tricky and can result in people kind of like limiting their options down to what works with the mechanics. But you do have the other option, which I think works well with things like vampire and mage and stuff like that, where you have, it's a slightly smaller set of skills, but you can apply them in much kind of broader ways, which means you can think of your solution and then it's your GM's problem what you actually roll to do it. You know what you're doing, and it's up to the GM to fit the rules around you rather than fitting you around the rules.
Yeah, I mean, kind of following on with that, very much very much GM discretion, but I do like to I do like there to be a social mechanic, because that way, that also, as long as you've got that, you've also got the that also gives you the opportunity to critically fail or critically succeed where you might not otherwise. If you're sat there, I as a player may be playing a political genius, but isn't. But but I've been put in a situation where I need to find a fix. So, GM will have a sort of, you'll have a quick conversation with GM. What would you like to achieve here? I think I know it's fairly trivial, but I need to talk us all out of getting a speeding ticket here. And then, it's okay, yeah, roll on your whatever, whichever appropriate skill happens to be there. Are you trying to bluff? Are you trying to bluff the ticket warden? Or are you trying to charm them? Do you do you simply lower your glasses in a seductive way? I mean, what the options of right? Just so you see, the options are both consistent and many. Anyway,
David, do you have any?
I think the reason I'm talking about live role playing again. In live role playing, social skills are often hard skill, You have to actually do the talking and do the persuading. But I think there's an issue quite often where, as Russ said, you're not the political genius, you're not the Machiavellian, you're not the charmer, you're not the seducer. You need to have, I think, in tabletop, definitely it's an accessibility issue, because not everybody can pull off that level of role play and convincingly persuade somebody that they are, whatever. What I tend to do for the tabletop is I get them to first of all role play through the encounter, and then I let them make the roll. And if they've really done an impressive job of role playing it, I'll give them a bonus. Or maybe the consequences of failure might not be quite so bad. So there's a little bit of advantage there, but I think there needs to be something to support those who just can't do it, or maybe too shy, or all that sort of thing. I think that's what it's for, I think.
Yeah, I hear RPGs, especially D&D, but most RPGs generally, described as improv theater with maths. And I think that captures it very, very well, because what the maths is doing is supporting the bits that we can't necessarily improv. It is not always reasonable for us to improv stabbing 50 goblins with a +5 magic sword. And it is not always reasonable for us to be able to improv talking the Viscount out of chucking the prince's firstborn off a balcony in a sacrifice to the Dreadlord Baal. So sometimes we need mechanics for us to do these things, and that's where the maths comes in to support our improv theatre that we're having with 6 of us around a table and a couple of pints.
I think it just have to be. It just have to be both. It just have to be both. Yeah, and I think that's important.
You said all of that.
Just
the rule of the rule of cool is
yeah.
Do like
So I'm gonna plug a role-playing game, Genesis. Those who know me well will know that I often shill for this role-playing game. This is it was Fantasy Flight Games, it's now Edge Studios, so it's not what I'd call an indie game necessarily, but Genesis has a concept of a social encounter, which is really interesting, because every character in Genesis has a matrix of what they want. So they have like a motivation, a fear, a flaw, and something else I can't remember, but 2 positive and 2 negative. And in any given encounter, there's this structure for rolling social encounters where you roll your dice, and like if you roll certain results, like the GM might give you a hint as to like, well, this is what this person is trying to achieve. So if you say something like this, you'll derail them and you'll put them on the back foot. And it kind of, I know what you mean, David, about rolling and having a bonus to a roll if someone's role played well. But in Genesis and in Star Wars, with the Fantasy Flight Star Wars system, which is effectively the precursor of all sets Genesis, I tend to actually do it the other way around. I encourage people to roll. I mean, kind of say like, are you trying to charm or coerce or negotiate, or like what's the general gist, and then roll, and then I will play it with them, and if they've done astoundingly well, my character will constantly be kind of like fumbling and flubbing and not picking up on mistakes the character's making, whereas if they've done very badly, it'll be the opposite. And I think that gives us the freedom of saying, well, we know you're going to win, so you don't need to feel pressured when you're improving this scene, because we both are working towards the same resolution as dictated by the mechanics, but we can role play it in that framework, and we're not competing, we're working together to get to where we know we're trying to get to. And that, because I think the hardest thing with social encounters in role-playing games is feeling like as a player you're opposite to the GM and you're competing, and I think trying to get away from that can be really helpful. Just some thoughts there. Highly recommend Genesis for that. There's a comment in the and I will just say there was a comment in the chat, which also was from Jonathan Baddeley, which reinforces some of the things you three were saying, which is the social skills in role-playing games are great for players who don't have those social skills in real life. And I can't hit any goblins with my sword, so I am definitely there with him. So we have a comment from Griffin, which is the best thing for a GM to do is ask the player, how are you doing that? And I think that ties into kind of working with players as a GM. So how do we feel that? Because I think, I mean, maybe this is controversial. I think D&D always historically kind of pitched the GM as at odds with the party. So how do we feel that role-playing games now work to bring players kind of oriented in the same direction? I'm imagining LARPs do this quite well. So David, do you want to?
You mean about how so the adversarial situation D&D between GMs and players? Yes, I think a lot of the time D&D was all about the GM was usually playing towards an enemy. But I think if we talked about story-led stuff, which again a lot more LARP is going towards these days. I mean, LARP didn't used to be like this because it used to be just the same as D&D. It's just evolved the same way. But I think if you talk about more story-led stuff, it is about you're working with the GM to build a story. And as you just said about you know what the outcome is, let's work towards the outcome. I think a lot of it, I've noticed a lot of LARPs recently that I've played in, there has been an element of the referees doing quite a lot of setting things up, like, for example, giving players a hero moment. So it's that I said, of putting them in a situation where they will come out looking good as characters and have this that epic battle type thing. I think it's that, if that's what you mean, so that cooperation.
Russell, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's another. That's another one I'd almost lead with. I prefer the term storyteller. Actually, it's not. This isn't strictly true of all games, but at the end of it, but the one thing that is certainly for me and my enjoyment as a when I GM is that if I've got a group together, I like to think I've got an idea where they want to go with what they're doing, what we want, and then I think stop saying because it's more of a we. At the end of the day, if I'm running a game that players haven't enjoyed it, I will consider that. I will consider that a failure. I'll wonder why and see what's going on and work on the next time. Sometimes it can't be helped. You just may have, going back to it earlier, you may just have the wrong group for the thing that you were originally doing. But I don't know. I find it a lot easier these days because just because I'm not because usually I'm playing with people I know, so it's sort of so I feel like I can ask them the right questions from the point we've started character gemming or whatever. And so, I was thinking it's going to go more. I was thinking it's going to go something down this route. I probably need a bare minimum of these type of characters, these type of skills. How does this sound? And just the whole thing is just a collaborative effort.
That makes sense. Z, do you want to?
I have the cheater's answer, which is that these days we have GM-less RPGs. You can't be adversarial if you don't exist.
There's a comment about religion here somewhere, but let's ignore that.
One of the ones I mentioned earlier that you very kindly went and dug up, Tale's End, that's an improvisational GM-less one, because that's by taking away the someone else is kind of in charge of story beats and what's happening. It means that everyone kind of has to pitch in, and that can very, very much depend on your players. It really depends on your players. I don't think I would go GM-less with people I didn't know and hadn't played a game with before. I would need to know what these people are like and who is a horrifying munchkin, and then not play with the horrifying munchkin unless we were doing a dungeon crawl. But for when you want to avoid the kind of GM versus players, just don't have a GM anymore. There are ways of doing it now. It's great.
Now, this is a very good point, and something I should have asked about earlier. But yes, no, indeed. So we've probably got time for one more thing to ask the panelists before I need to dash off and be on a closing ceremony. So I'm going to ask all of you, what's the game that excites you most at the moment outside of D&D? It doesn't have to be your favorite. It doesn't have to be the one you're currently playing. Just like, which one today, now, which one are you most excited about? David, I'll start with you.
I think I fell in love with Mage in the 90s and haven't fallen out of love with it yet. So it's the one, if there's ever a chance to play it, I will play it. Because I love the flexibility and the way you can sort of do pretty much anything within very, very loose limits. And especially like running it, because the players can, as I said before, the players can surprise you. And it's a good way of, so this idea of building a tank out of a wheelchair and it's embark. And it just that one took me by surprise. And I think that's the heart of a good session, is when the players do something so unexpected. As someone just said in the chat, no plot survives contact with the players, and that's, I think, it's a good thing to be aware of whenever you run anything. So.
Russ?
I think my answer to this is frequently going to depend on what I'm playing, on what I'm playing or involved with at the time. So my answer with that will be GURPS and Star Wars right now. And the version of Star Wars I'm in at the moment is the West End games, but yeah, with a little bit of homebrew. But yeah, it's just I gave my GM for that sort of, right, okay, fine, I'm going to play this on hard mode. Here, you can beat me with this particular stick at any time. And then the GM decided to take that up a level. I suddenly became I suddenly realized suddenly found out in season 2 I had a 14-year-old daughter who has also eventually run off, and it's all got really angsty now, and it's great. And on the other side of the coin, we've got on the other side of the coin, I'm playing basically a Kenyan MacGyver who is bouncing between various dimensions and worlds, and currently we're stuck in something that's that would be Heartbeat if we'd leave it alone, but we're not going to.
Excellent. Z, what's currently exciting you the most?
What's exciting me tends to be whatever I've read about most recently, because at the moment I'm reading about so many things. A couple that are really appealing to me is one that's called "What's So Cool About Time Loops," because I love time loop conceits in shows and films and stuff like that. I love watching people try and work out that they're in a time loop. I love watching them try and work out how to get out of it or what's causing it and things like that. And this is a game about that. It's got a handful of potential things, like this is the day we climb out of the trenches for the full frontal assault again and again, or this is the family holiday that burned down Grandma Mary's house, or this is the day of your final exams, or this is the day a meteor is about to hit the city. And it gives you these things, and it also gives you some things that might have caused the time loops and stuff like that. So that one's interesting to me because I love that genre. And then there's another one that's interesting to me right now called Petitioners of Zed, which is it's not huge. It's one of those little downloadable $6 PDF things. But it's got the things I like. It's got playable alien species. It's got a vast and trackless swamp full with beasts and spirits and broken dreams. Your main goal of the whole thing is to have a chat with an enigmatic bog witch, which I love. It's a little bit sci-fi. It's a little bit fantasy. It has some mild horror vibes to it. So that one looks fun just because of the texture that's on it. And there's one other one that has become newly relevant and which I've chatted to you about before, John, Balikbayan, which is a Filipino near-future fantasy apocalypse game. And that one is relevant again because Netflix has just had a series out called Trece, which is about supernatural urban goings on in the Philippines. So if you have watched Trece and you have enjoyed Trece, try Balikbayan, because now you can go and play an RPG that lets you get to grips with all of those cool monsters that you've just been watching about.
Excellent stuff. I'm very quickly going to say I'm excited about a game called Trial. I heard it on the One Shot podcast and I thought it sounded really interesting. It's a one shot where you play through a trial and you basically play the various witnesses in the case. And at the end, you work out whether or not the person on trial is innocent or guilty, but it explores themes of the relationship of Black people to justice in America, because the titular trial is the trial of a Black man who's on murder for murdering a white woman. And it's really interesting. And it was really, I just was fascinated by the source material. And I thought it was real evidence that some of the more esoteric RPGs can really start dealing with some proper subject material, which I just find fascinating. But other than that, also Star Wars. Because I love Star Wars too.
Who doesn't love Star Wars?
Yes. It is 17:59, so I'm going to say thank you very much to my three panelists for an amazing panel. I will encourage everyone to come to the closing ceremony, but I will also encourage you all to turn your mics and video on and chat to my lovely panelists if they are around.
I have to go and get dinner, so I can do neither of these things.
That is fair.
But if you're on the Discord, please DM me and I will happily send a link to the big spreadsheet I'm putting together so you can troll through it for so many RPGs that none of us will get a chance to play, and maybe you will.
I will DM you in a minute because there's something I absolutely have to mention to you if you're ready. So
okay, thank you very much, everyone.
All
I'm
right.
intending to turn the Otter off unless you particularly want me to leave it on. Is anyone relying on the Otter transcription?
I think you can probably turn it off. Thank you very much, Catherine.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
And the Zoom host can stop recording.
Yep. To Joss